The words came like a slap in the heat of late afternoon. Asterisk, another street rat thinking she owns the sidewalk. Asterisk, they carried the casual cruelty of a man who thought his badge was a crown. Those words would become the epitaph of Officer Frank Miller's career. Dr. Lena Walker stood quietly on the corner of 5th and Elm, the setting sun on her back, waiting for the light to change. She was dressed simply, a light summer dress, sandals, and a canvas tote bag filled with library books from the university. The bag hung heavy on her shoulder, the day's warmth lingering on her skin. She had walked this neighborhood countless times. It was part of her evening routine after lecturing on social structures and justice at the university. But to Miller, she was not a professor, not a neighbor, not a citizen. She was an intrusion, a shadow on a street he believed he owned. Miller was built like a wall, his neck thick, his eyes cold and permanent with disdain. He and his rookie partner, Officer Evans, were patrolling as part of what the department called a neighborhood cleanup initiative, a euphemism for harassment, thinly veiled as community policing. Their unspoken mission was simple: remind anyone who didn't fit the new image of the gentrifying district that they didn't belong. Miller stepped into her path, blocking the crosswalk. His shadow fell across her feet like a shroud. "Can't you read the sign?" he barked. "No loitering." Lena turned to glance at the post beside her. The sign said walk/don't walk. There was no mention of loitering. Her pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm. "Officer, I'm just waiting to cross the street," she said evenly. Her tone, polite but self-assured, seemed to inflame him. His sneer deepened. "Talking back to me? You people always got an answer for everything, don't you?" He took a step closer, invading her space, the smell of sweat and leather from his uniform pressing against her composure. "Let's see some ID." Lena reached in her tote bag carefully. "It's in my wallet," she said, but his hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Slowly," he warned. "Don't want you reaching for a weapon." The absurdity hit her like a wave. A woman in a sundress, her bag full of books, accused of being armed. Still, she moved carefully, pulling her wallet out and presenting her driver's license. He barely looked at it before tossing it back at her. "Address says 6 blocks into the nice part of town," he said. "What are you doing over here?" "Casing houses." Evans shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Frank, maybe we should." "Shut up, rookie," Miller snapped. His gaze never left Lena. "I'm handling this." Then his eyes drifted upward, settling on her hair, long, beautifully maintained dreadlocks, woven with patience and pride. Each strand was a quiet declaration of identity and heritage. But to Miller, there was something else. To him, they were defiance. "Look at this mess," he said, his tone dripping with mock disgust. "Probably got roaches in there. We're running a city health initiative, too. Can't have unhygienic people spreading disease." Lena's heartbeat thundered her chest. The air around her seemed to shrink. Fear mixed with disbelief, then cold fury. This wasn't about loitering. This was about power, about humiliation dressed up as authority. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling as he reached into a pouch on his belt. From it, Miller drew a pair of heavy-duty steel shears, the kind used to cut through seat belts or clothing at accident scenes. The setting sun flashed along the blades. "Public sanitation," he said, his grin widening. "You're a public nuisance, and we clean up nuisances." Evans stepped forward, his voice rising in panic. "Frank, for God's sake, you can't be serious." But Miller ignored him. Other officers from a nearby patrol car had gathered, phones in hand, recording, smirking, waiting. This was entertainment, the evening's cruel ritual. Lena tried to step back, but Miller's hand gripped her arm and shoved her against the rough brick wall. The scrape tore through the fabric of her dress, stinging her bare shoulder. She gasped in pain. He grabbed a fistful of her dreadlocks, yanking her head back. "Hold still," he said through gritted teeth. "This is for your own good." The first snip was loud enough to echo down the street. A lock of hair she had spent a decade nurturing fell to the dusty sidewalk. Then another, and another. Each metallic bite of the blades tore through more than just hair. It sheared at her dignity, her identity, her safety. Tears slid silently down her face, catching the golden light as they fell. But she did not cry out. She did not give him that satisfaction. She stared at the faces of the laughing officers, memorizing everyone. With each lock that dropped, a new resolve hardened inside her. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea what he was unleashing. To him, she was just another black woman to be degraded, a trophy of his control. But in truth, he was sealing his fate with every cruel snip. When he was finished, her dreadlocks lay in a heap at her feet, a grotesque offering to his arrogance. He stepped back, wiping the blades on his pant leg. "There," he said proudly. "Much cleaner. Now get out of my neighborhood." He turned toward the watching officers, triumphant. "See, that's how you do community policing." Laughter erupted behind him. Lena bent down slowly. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the severed locks, the strands coiling in her palm like something sacred. Her breathing was uneven, but her eyes had changed. They no longer held fear, only a glacial calm that terrified those who saw it. She looked up at Miller. The street seemed to still around her. Traffic sounds faded, even the laughter dimmed. Her gaze was steady, cutting through the air like a blade. He winked at her, that same smirk of dominance he had worn since the first moment. It would be the last time he ever felt in control. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The power in the silence was absolute. Later, in the precinct's fluorescent glare, Officer Miller would lean back in his chair, smirking again, confident in the well-practiced lies that had always saved him. He would file his report, reshape the story, and twist truth into the language the system knew too well: an unstable transient, an unhygienic threat, standard procedure. But the street outside Fifth and Elm would remember something different. The warm light fading over red bricks, the soft sound of steel meeting hair, and the still figure of a woman who refused to scream. That silence, more powerful than any outburst, would become the turning point of the city. Because that woman, humiliated, bruised, and calm, was not nameless. She was Dr. Lena Walker, a tenured professor, a federal consultant, and the wife of the most powerful man in their police department. In that single moment, that quiet, brutal act under the dying light would ignite a reckoning that neither Miller nor his entire precinct could ever escape. For now, though, as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared beyond the skyline, Lena stood motionless amid the fallen remnants of her hair, a portrait of grace against the face of cruelty, a storm waiting to rise. Her dignity, though violated, was unbroken. Her silence was not defeat. It was declaration. And before the night was over, that declaration would shake the very foundations of power. The fluorescent lights inside the precinct buzzed faintly, painting the room in a flat, sickly white. Officer Frank Miller sat at his desk, leaning back with smug satisfaction. The posture of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had played this game before: a questionable arrest on the street, a half-truth report, and a system that always leaned in his favor. He knew the language of survival here, the phrases that turned cruelty into procedure, humiliation into protocol. It was the language of power. Across the room, his rookie partner, Evans, sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes darting between Miller and the paperwork in front of him. His conscience was burning. He could still hear the sound of the shears, the sickening rhythm of each snip, the woman's silent defiance. He hadn't been able to sleep since they brought her in. Miller, meanwhile, hummed a tune under his breath, writing his report with the casual arrogance of someone who had done this too many times and never faced consequences. Sergeant O'Malley, a grizzled veteran whose belly strained against his shirt buttons, approached with a clipboard. His voice carried the weight of years in the job. "Miller, talk to me. What the hell was that circus on 5th and Elm? Dispatch says I got half a dozen officers filming some kind of haircut." Miller chuckled, not even looking up. "Just handling a public nuisance, Sarge. Nothing to worry about." O'Malley raised an eyebrow. "A public nuisance? The report I got says unlawful use of a cutting instrument." Miller leaned forward, lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence. "Look, Sarge, the woman was a transient, clearly unstable. We approached her, asked for ID, and she went ballistic, screaming, spitting, trying to bite Evans. Said she had a disease and was going to infect us all. I made a judgment call. Evans' head snapped up. His mouth opened, ready to speak the truth, but one sharp look from Miller froze him. She was unhygienic, Miller continued, his voice gaining speed, spinning the story into a familiar script. Her hair was filthy. We got the new city mandate about public sanitation. I used the shears as a last resort to subdue her and prevent possible contamination. O'Malley rubbed his temples, sighing. He'd heard this song before, the same melody of convenient lies. A dangerous transient, a biohazard threat, an unstable suspect. Miller's reports always sounded airtight. They were polished in just the right way, believable enough for the system to accept and dismiss. You cut her hair off in the street because you thought it was a biohazard? O'Malley muttered. I was de-escalating, Miller replied smoothly, using the buzzword like a weapon. She was getting combative. It was either a taser or the shears. I chose the lesser option. Controlled application of necessary measures. O'Malley didn't respond. He turned away, his heavy steps fading down the corridor. Meanwhile, behind a locked cell door, Lena Walker sat on a cold metal bench. The stench of disinfectant and stale air clung to everything. They had taken her tote bag, her phone, even her shoes. What they couldn't take, though they tried, was her composure. She wasn't panicking. She was observing. Through the narrow window of her cell, she could see the bullpen. She could hear Miller's voice, its rhythm, its false confidence. Each lie he told was a note she recorded in her mind. Every procedural misstep, from the illegal arrest to the absence of Miranda rights, became evidence, brick by brick, in the case she was quietly building around them. Evans avoided looking at her. He sat at his desk like a child who knew he'd watched something unforgivable. O'Malley, at the far end of the room, looked exhausted, already worn down by the moral weight of the uniform he wore. They thought she was just another name, just another woman with no power, no voice. But they had no idea who she was. Dr. Lena Walker wasn't merely a sociology professor. Her book, The Blue Wall, Procedural Violations and Systemic Bias in Urban Policing, was required reading at the state's police academy. For the past 5 years, she had worked as a federal consultant for the Department of Justice, specializing in the use of force and accountability policies. And most importantly, her husband was the man who ran this department, Chief of Police David Walker. They didn't know that yet, but they would. Time stretched on in the holding cell, punctuated only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sound of distant typewriters. Then the door clanked open. A young officer, Ortiz, appeared. Time for booking, he said curtly. Lena stood. The movement was deliberate, controlled. She followed him into a sterile booking room with a camera and fingerprint scanner on the counter. Name? Ortiz asked. You have my driver's license, Lena replied, her voice even. He sighed. Just answer the question. Lena Walker, she said. He typed the name into the system. All right, Ms. Walker. You're being charged with loitering, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. Lena raised an eyebrow. Which officer did I assault? Officer Miller, Ortiz said, not meeting her eyes. Says you try to bite him. I see, Lena said softly. Before we proceed, I'd like to invoke my right to legal counsel and my right to one phone call under the Sixth Amendment in Miranda versus Arizona. Ortiz blinked. The legal precision of her words threw him off balance. Yeah, you get a call. He shoved a grimy phone toward her. Lena picked up the receiver and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice. A deep voice answered. Walker, David. David, she said, her voice steady. I'm at the downtown precinct. There's been an incident. I need you to initiate a Code 3 lockdown, preservation of evidence protocol. She paused, breathing deeply. And, David, tell Internal Affairs to bring a bigger bag. They're going to need it. The moment she hung up, a quiet ripple began moving through the precinct. Officer Ortiz, who had overheard the strange call, returned to his desk with a puzzled look. The tone hadn't been desperate like a detainee calling for help. It had been sharp, professional, commanding. He muttered under his breath, Code 3, lockdown, preservation of evidence. He brought it up to O'Malley, who was still trying to process Miller's report. She say who she was calling? O'Malley asked absently. Just said the name David, Ortiz replied. O'Malley froze. The name was common, sure, but something about it made his stomach tighten. The woman's calm, her legal precision, the unease in the room, it didn't add up. He had seen plenty of street arrests. None of them acted like this. None of them spoke like that. Back in the booking room, another officer, Peterson, a weary woman with kind eyes dulled by bureaucracy, stepped forward to take Lena's fingerprints. Lena raised her hands. I'll comply, she said. But before you proceed, please note for the record that I have not been allowed to wash my hands since my arrest. Any residue or material found on them was present at the time of the incident on 5th and Elm. Peterson hesitated. I'm also requesting that my clothing be bagged as evidence, Lena continued calmly. It contains fibers and debris from the officer who assaulted me. The officer blinked, caught off guard. No one ever spoke like this. And under Department Regulation 7.14, subsection B, Lena added, any arrestee claiming injury must be offered medical attention. The officer pulled my hair and scraped my back against a wall. I'm not requesting medical treatment, but I do request that you document my injuries and your failure to offer aid as a procedural violation. Peterson stared at her in silence. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to do. This wasn't the usual script. This woman wasn't a suspect. She was a professional dismantling their process one line of policy at a time. Out in the bullpen, the dispatch radio crackled to life. All units, level 2 alert for downtown precinct. All external communications are to be routed through the captain's office. No one enters or leaves without authorization from the chief's office. The words fell like thunder. Miller, still joking with another officer, froze mid-sentence. What the hell's that about? O'Malley's face had gone pale. He was connecting the dots. The strange phone call, the composed detainee, the sudden lockdown. He walked quickly to the holding area and peered through the narrow glass window. Lena met his gaze. Calm, poised, unafraid. She looked less like a detainee and more like a queen inspecting her captors. A suffocating silence filled O'Malley's chest. He knew instinctively something catastrophic was about to unfold. Moments later, the precinct doors burst open. Two commanding figures strode through, Deputy Chief Harris and Commander Jennings. Their faces were grim, their pace unrelenting. They didn't speak to anyone at the front desk. They moved with purpose, cutting through the stunned silence of the bullpen like blades. O'Malley, Harris said sharply. My office. Now. The sergeant obeyed without a word, his gut heavy with dread. Miller watched them go, his smug confidence flickering. Why are the brass here for a vagrancy arrest? He muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Evans sat frozen, his face pale. The hum of the precinct had died. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were left dangling off hooks. It was as if the entire building sensed an approaching storm. 10 minutes later, O'Malley emerged from the office. His face looked years older. He walked straight toward Miller's desk. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. Who was she, Frank? Miller frowned. What are you talking about? O'Malley's voice cracked. Who the hell was the woman you arrested? Miller shrugged, trying to summon his usual arrogance. Some street rat. Sarge, I told you. Don't lie to me. O'Malley hissed the words like a warning. Don't you lie to me now. And then the front doors opened again. Every head turned. The room froze. The weight of authority entered the building with the quiet precision of a blade sliding from its sheath. Standing in the doorway was Chief David Walker. He was tall, commanding, his face carved with fury held tightly in check. His presence alone shifted the air. The chatter died. Every officer in the room instinctively straightened, eyes forward, hearts pounding. Walker's gaze swept across the room, cold and exacting, until it settled on O'Malley. He didn't need to shout. His voice, when it came, was low and deadly calm. Sergeant, he said, where's my wife? The words hit like a grenade. The oxygen left the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Miller's blood ran cold. His stomach twisted into ice. Wife. The word echoed through his skull like a death knell. The woman the street rat, the public nuisance, was the chief's wife. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. But as he looked around, he saw confirmation in every face. Evans, white as chalk. O'Malley, trembling. The entire precinct, frozen in disbelief. The pieces were falling together, one after another, each one another nail in the coffin of his career. Chief Walker took 2 deliberate steps into the room, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I'll ask one more time, Sergeant," he said. "Where is Dr. Lena Walker?" O'Malley pointed, his hand shaking. She's in holding. Cell B." Walker didn't say another word. He turned, his deputies falling in a step behind him. The sound of their boots echoed through the hall like the march of judgment. Miller sat paralyzed, sweat breaking across his brow. Somewhere deep inside him, the last flicker of arrogance guttered out. He could hear the jingle of keys, the clank of a cell door, and then silence. A silence so complete it rang louder than any noise. When Chief Walker returned, Lena was beside him. He had taken off his own jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders. The sight of her, proud, wounded, unbroken, cut through the room like divine retribution. Every officer present understood. This wasn't just an internal matter anymore. It was a reckoning. And as the chief's eyes locked on Miller, the man who had once believed he owned the streets finally understood. His power had never been real. It was borrowed, and it had just been revoked. The air inside the downtown precinct felt like it had turned to glass, fragile, cold, and ready to shatter. Chief David Walker stood in the center of the bullpen, his posture controlled, his voice silent, but commanding more power than a shout ever could. His very presence reshaped the room. The officers who had spent their careers swaggering behind their badges now stood frozen, their authority stripped bare in the presence of the man whose wife they had brutalized. Miller couldn't move. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him pale and clammy. His smirk, the armor of arrogance he wore like a second skin, was gone. His mind screamed for excuses, explanations, anything, but all he could do was stare at the chief's expressionless face. The room's chatter had evaporated. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to pause, as if the building itself feared to make a sound. Chief Walker's eyes, sharp as cold steel, moved from desk to desk before landing on Sergeant O'Malley. "Where," he asked again, each word deliberate, "is my wife?" O'Malley swallowed hard. "She's in holding, Chief. Cell B." Walker's jaw tightened, but his voice remained low, deadly calm. "Open it." Without waiting for an order, the deputy chief and Commander Jennings fell in a step behind him. The sound of their boots echoed like thunder down the hallway. Doors that normally resisted authority swung open without question. The entire precinct held its breath as the chief disappeared into the corridor that led to the holding cells. Miller wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to vanish before the inevitable collapse of everything he had built on lies and intimidation. But his legs refused to move. His body was locked in the paralysis of fear. Minutes later, the silence was broken only by the faint jingle of keys, the squeal of metal hinges, and then nothing. A quiet that felt infinite. When Chief Walker returned, he was no longer just the head of the department. He was the embodiment of authority and retribution. And beside him walked Lena, his wife, his equal, the woman Miller had dared to humiliate. The room went deathly still. Her appearance was both devastating and regal. She wore her husband's dark suit jacket over her torn dress. Her shoulders were scraped, her scalp uneven and raw, but she carried herself with such composure that every officer instinctively lowered their gaze. The very sight of her was indictment enough. Chief Walker's expression was unreadable as he stopped in the middle of the room. His voice was calm, but every syllable carried the weight of command. "That man," he said, pointing toward Miller without even looking at him, "place him under arrest." 2 plainclothes internal affairs detectives stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway. They hadn't arrived by coincidence. They had come prepared. Miller's heart seized. "On what charge?" he stammered, his voice breaking. You can't just..." "Assault with a deadly weapon," Chief Walker replied coldly. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Official misconduct. He paused, his tone sharpening like a blade. And that's just for starters. Miller's mouth opened, desperate for breath or reason. This is insane. She was resisting. She was a threat. Walker didn't even flinch. A threat. His voice lowered to a growl that seemed to vibrate in the air. You cut her hair off in the street. Miller turned, grasping for validation, but none came. Evans sat at his desk, his face pale as paper. The rookie's trembling hands clenched into fists. Tell him, Evans. Miller shouted. Tell him she was aggressive. Tell him she. But Evans wasn't looking at him. He was speaking quietly to Commander Jennings, his words spilling out in a rush of terrified honesty. He told me to shut up. He pulled out the shears. She didn't do anything. She just stood there. He shoved her against the wall, and Evans's voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. The confession broke the last illusion of Miller's control. Chief Walker's eyes swept across the room, landing on every officer who had been there, the ones who had laughed, who had filmed. They couldn't meet his gaze. Every officer present at 5th and Elm, he said, his voice resonating with power, surrender your phones and body cameras. Now, no one moved. The chief stepped forward, his tone turning lethal. Every single one of you is a material witness and a subject in a federal investigation. Consider yourselves on administrative leave, effective immediately. The spell broke. The officers scrambled to obey, fumbling with devices, the clink of metal and plastic filling the air. The blue wall of silence, that unspoken fraternity that had protected men like Miller for decades, was crumbling under the force of one man's fury. Chief Walker turned to his deputy. Seal this precinct. No one leaves. No data is wiped. I want every log, every report, every scrap of paper from the last 3 hours. I want the server backups. I want everything. Harris nodded and began barking orders. The command structure of the precinct folded inward, reshaping itself around the chief's will. Miller sat down heavily, his mind reeling. His arrogance, his certainty, had been replaced by sheer disbelief. He had humiliated plenty of people before. He had lied, manipulated, and covered his tracks. The system had always bent in his favor. It had never occurred to him that it could break. The most damning witness, however, was still strapped to his own chest. One of the detectives unclipped Miller's body camera and placed it in an evidence bag. Miller tried to protest, but the look in Chief Walker's eyes silenced him. That small black box, the device he thought would protect him, was now his executioner. It held his sneering voice, his laughter, the metallic snip of the shears, and the chorus of mockery from the officers who had stood by. It held the truth. For years, Miller had used his badge like a weapon, his authority like armor. Now that same system he had exploited was about to consume him whole. Walker watched him in silence. Lena stood beside her husband, quiet but resolute, her eyes unflinching. She didn't need to speak. Her very presence was testimony enough. The precinct was no longer Miller's playground. It was his prison, and in the quiet, the weight of justice settled in. Hours later, the chief's office looked like the war room of a battle in progress. Files lay open across the table, illuminated by the low glow of the desk lamp. The blinds were drawn, shutting out the city lights. The only sound was the distant hum of servers pulling every bit of data connected to Miller's shift. Lena sat wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea between her hands. The trembling had stopped. The exhaustion had not. Her husband stood by the window, his back to her, staring out over the city he was sworn to protect. His reflection in the glass looked older, heavier. "I'm so sorry, Lena," he said finally, his voice rough with pain. "That this happened. That it happened here in my city with my officers. I'm sorry." Lena looked at him gently, her voice soft but unwavering. "It wasn't your fault, David. It was his and the system that made him." He turned then, his eyes burning with restrained rage. She had seen that look before, the one that appeared when he was about to rebuild something from its ashes. "Then we burned the system down," he said. He reached for a thick folder lying on his desk, sealed with red tape and labeled Internal Affairs. Miller, Frank. I had them pull his file, he said grimly. It's worse than I imagined. He broke the seal. Pages spilled out. Incident reports, complaints, photographs, transcripts. The illusion of the model officer disintegrated before their eyes, replaced by a grotesque history of unchecked abuse. Complaint number 1, he began, reading aloud. Maria Flores, 68 years old, claims Officer Miller pulled her over for a broken taillight, called her a racial slur, and threatened to call immigration if she didn't show proper respect. Complaint dismissed as misunderstanding of tone. He flipped another page. Complaint 7. Marcus Cole, 19, black college student, stopped for fitting the description of a robbery suspect. No suspect description had been broadcast. Miller slammed him against his car. Chipped tooth. Case closed. Unsubstantiated. Lena felt the nausea rise in her chest. Each file was another piece of evidence, another life diminished. She had written about this pattern for years, the normalization of cruelty, the bureaucracy of silence. Listen to this one, David said, his voice darkening. Complaint 18. Fatima Al-Jamil, young Muslim woman leaving a community center. Miller and his partner cornered her, demanded to know what was in her backpack. He called her hijab a terrorist rag. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her and told her women like her needed to learn their place. Finding, proactive counterterrorism patrol. Complainant uncooperative. Lena closed her eyes. He sees women of color as less than human, she whispered. Objects to control. My hair, it wasn't just humiliation. It was domination. A way to strip me of identity. David slammed the folder shut. 43 complaints in 12 years, he said through clenched teeth. Excessive force. Racial slurs. Illegal searches. Not one suspension. Not one formal reprimand. He looked at her, his voice breaking. Every supervisor who could have stopped him turned a blind eye. They buried it. They protected him. They failed all of them, Lena said quietly, touching the file. And tonight it metastasized. David nodded slowly. Not anymore. He picked up his phone, dialing a direct line. This isn't just an internal matter anymore, he said, his tone shifting from grief to command. We're handing everything to the district attorney's office. Criminal charges. Every piece of it. As he spoke, Lena sat back, exhaustion mingled with grim satisfaction. This was justice. Not the theatrical kind seen in courts or speeches, but the quiet, relentless kind born from pain. The kind that rebuilt a city from within. That night, the official statement went out to every local station. A police officer had been arrested for assault and abuse of authority. The department had initiated a full internal review. For the first time in decades, the city believed those words might actually mean something. 2 weeks later, the disciplinary hearing was held not in a small, private office, but in the grand auditorium of City Hall. Chief Walker had insisted on transparency. Cameras were allowed. The public was invited. Rows of chairs filled with reporters, activists, and citizens who had lived too long under the shadow of silence. At the front sat the hearing board. Beside them, Dr. Lena Walker. She was no longer a victim in torn clothing. She wore a tailored red dress, her hair now cut into a short, elegant afro, the color of power and defiance. The room fell silent as she took her seat beside the department's legal counsel. Frank Miller sat across from her in a cheap gray suit. His once imposing posture had crumbled into a slump of fatigue and fear. The arrogance that once defined him had rotted into self-pity. Lena opened a folder and looked up. Officer Miller, she began, her tone calm and devastatingly precise. In your official report, you stated that you perceive my dreadlocks as a potential biohazard. Is that correct? Miller mumbled something incoherent. Yes. Can you cite the specific departmental health code or city ordinance that gives an officer authority to forcibly cut a citizen's hair based on a visual assessment? His lawyer rose. Objection. This is a disciplinary hearing, not a courtroom. Overruled, Chief Walker said from the board center. His voice was cold, professional. The officer will answer. Miller fumbled. It was a judgment call, based on training. Lena didn't blink. What training specifically? Can you name the course, the instructor, or the section in the manual that sanctions that action? Silence. Then she moved to his next claim. You also wrote that I was physically combative and that you chose the less forceful option. The department's use of force continuum outlines 5 escalating stages. Can you explain how using steel shears on an unarmed woman qualifies as de-escalation? He said nothing. Was a taser your only other option? She pressed. Did you consider disengaging, calling for a supervisor, or were you more interested in spectacle? Every word she spoke peeled away another layer of his facade. Finally, she signaled for the evidence screen. The lights dimmed. The footage played. Miller's voice filled the room, dripping with contempt. Another street rat thinking she owns the sidewalk. They watched him mock, threaten, and cut her hair as others laughed. Evan's pleading voice echoed faintly. Frank, stop. The audience's faces twisted in disbelief and disgust. When the video ended, there was no applause. Only silence and tears. Chief Walker stood. This board has reviewed your record, he said. 43 prior complaints wrongfully dismissed. A pattern of behavior that violates policy, decency, and the oath you swore. He leaned forward. You were not policing. You were praying. He turned toward the audience. The blue wall came down 2 weeks ago, and it's not going back up. Facing Miller again, he pronounced sentence. Effective immediately, you were stripped of your badge and terminated for gross misconduct, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming an officer. A recommendation for permanent decertification will be filed with the state. Your entire file will be turned over to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. He lifted the gavel. This hearing is adjourned. The crack echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. For Miller, it was the end. For the city, it was the beginning. And for Lena Walker, it was vindication, not through vengeance, but through truth. The quiet power she had held in that moment on Fifth and Elm had blossomed into a movement. The silence that began as an act of survival had become the voice of reform. Justice had arrived, not with fury, but with precision, and it had her name on it. 6 months had passed since the night the city held its breath. The tremor that began on the corner of Fifth and Elm, an act of cruelty caught in the amber light of sunset, had grown into a seismic shift that shook the entire foundation of the justice system. The echoes of scissors cutting through dreadlocks had traveled far beyond that street. They had become the sound of reckoning. Frank Miller was no longer Officer Miller. He was inmate number 734, serving a 7-year prison sentence at the state penitentiary after pleading guilty to felony assault and multiple civil rights violations. His pension was gone. His name, once shouted through the corridors of the precinct with misplaced admiration, was now whispered at the police academy as a cautionary tale. His fall was not a tragedy. It was a necessary lesson written in disgrace. The other officers who had stood by, laughing, recording, and saying nothing, were all dismissed. Their careers ended not in retirement parties or commendations, but in quiet shame. Some left the state. Others filed appeals that went nowhere. The system they had helped protect for years no longer had a place for them. Evans, the rookie who had witnessed the incident, had chosen a different path. He had testified against Miller. His voice, shaking on the witness stand, had been one of the first to pierce the wall of silence. After a period of suspension and retraining, he was reinstated, this time partnered with a veteran female officer known for her empathy and commitment to community policing. He never wore the same confident grin again, but he learned the meaning of responsibility. Yet, the true change did not lie in Miller's prison sentence or the firings that followed. The real transformation was deeper, more structural, something that would live long after headlines faded. Chief David Walker, with Lena at his side, had initiated the most comprehensive police reform in the city's history. The framework they created would come to be known as the Walker Protocols. The reforms began with one simple idea. Transparency must never again be optional. Every incident involving use of force, no matter how minor, would now be automatically flagged and reviewed, not by internal affairs alone, but by an independent civilian oversight board. For the first time, Citizens had a voice in the evaluation of those sworn to protect them. The department's early warning system, a program meant to flag officers with multiple complaints before misconduct escalated, was overhauled entirely. Under Miller's reign of terror, that system had been a joke. Complaints vanished, were mislabeled, or buried under bureaucratic jargon. Lena redesigned it from scratch. She implemented mandatory intervention triggers. Any officer receiving 3 or more misconduct reports in 12 months would face automatic evaluation and retraining, regardless of rank. The Internal Affairs Division itself, once a fortress of secrecy, was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Half of its staff were civilians, legal experts, social scientists, and former community advocates, who brought new eyes and new accountability. The Brotherhood of Silence that had once shielded men like Miller was broken. Lena herself took a sabbatical from the university to lead the newly established Office of Police Accountability and Training. She had not sought the position. She had resisted it at first. But David knew, and so did she, that no one else could carry the moral authority she now embodied. When she stepped into that office for the first time, she carried both her trauma and her purpose. Her first act was symbolic and revolutionary. She removed the old department motto, "To serve and protect," from the wall and replaced it with a new one, engraved in brass. To be accountable and just. The new recruits entering the academy that year found a different kind of education awaiting them. Gone were the rote drills on control and compliance. In their place were immersive seminars on implicit bias, de-escalation, and cultural competence. Experts from across the nation were brought in to teach. But the most transformative sessions were the ones led by Lena herself. She would stand before a class of wide-eyed cadets, her voice calm, her gaze piercing. Her hair had grown into a short, natural style, a crown of resilience that framed her face with grace. Behind her, projected on the screen, was the footage from Miller's body camera. The sound of his sneering voice still made the room shift uncomfortably. She would let the video play in silence until the final moment when she bent down and picked up her severed dreadlocks. Then she would pause the footage and turn to class. "This," she would say quietly, "is what happens when power goes unchecked." Her words were not accusatory. They were instructional, heavy with experience. "He didn't just hurt me. He hurt this badge. He hurt every officer who does this job with integrity. Your duty is not only to avoid becoming him. It's to stop him when you see him in one of your own." No one spoke during those sessions. No one dared to. Outside the academy, the effects rippled through the city. The reopening of Miller's 43 complaint cases became a symbol of long overdue justice. The city council established a civil restitution fund to compensate his victims. Millions of dollars were distributed, but the true currency was acknowledgement. Each recipient received a formal letter of apology signed by Chief Walker himself, expressing the department's remorse for its failures. For Maria Flores, the grandmother threatened with deportation, the letter meant more than money. It was the recognition that she had been wronged, that her pain had been real. For Marcus Cole, the college student beaten for fitting a description, it was validation that his dignity had always mattered. The city was not healed overnight. No reform could erase decades of distrust, but it was moving forward. Police officers began walking their beats again, not from patrol cars but on foot, speaking with residents, rebuilding relationships one conversation at a time. Community meetings that had once been tense and performative became genuine dialogues. There was anger still, yes, but there was also hope. At the center of it all was Lena. Her name had become synonymous with accountability, not vengeance. Reporters called her the conscience of the city. Activists called her the quiet revolution. To the officers who trained under her, she was both teacher and reminder, a living embodiment of what justice looked like when courage met restraint. Every morning, she would walk past the precinct she once entered as a prisoner. The building now bore a new plaque near its entrance, in honor of Dr. Lena Walker, for turning pain into reform and silence into change. Inside her office, the once sterile walls were now lined with framed photographs of the people who had inspired reform. Maria, Marcus, Fatima Al-Jamil, and others whose names had been buried in complaint files. She called it her wall of truth. It reminded her daily of the work left to do. David often joined her there in the evenings. They would talk late into the night, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city outside. Their marriage had been tested in a way neither had imagined. Publicly, painfully, but it had emerged stronger. One evening, as the sunset spilled gold through the windows, David looked at her across the desk. "You realize you've changed everything," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "We did." He shook his head. "No, Lena, you did. I may have had the authority, but you had the courage." Her eyes softened, but there was no pride in them, only purpose. "Courage means nothing if it ends with me. It has to outlive us, David." It did. The Walker protocols soon spread beyond their city. Other departments across the state adopted variations of the system. Within 2 years, the Justice Department had issued national guidelines modeled after their reforms. Cities once resistant to change began implementing similar measures. What had started as a local scandal became a national blueprint for accountability. Lena, ever modest, avoided interviews and awards. When asked how she felt about becoming a public figure, she would simply say, "I didn't want fame. I wanted a system that doesn't break people like me." Still, there were nights when the memories returned. The scrape of the brick wall, the weight of Miller's hand in her hair, the sound of laughter. In those moments, she would close her eyes and breathe deeply, reminding herself that the past could no longer hurt her. It could only teach. Sometimes, she revisited the corner of 5th and Elm. It had become something of a quiet landmark. The city had installed a bronze plaque there, etched with a single sentence. "Dignity is not granted by power. It is revealed by resistance." The first time she saw it, Lena wept. Not a grief, but gratitude. The street that once symbolized humiliation now stood as a monument to resilience. The neighborhood around it, once fractured by fear, had become a symbol of renewal. The murals that lined the brick walls told stories of justice, empathy, and reform. Children played under the same streetlight that had witnessed her ordeal, their laughter a reminder that light always returns after darkness. One evening, as she stood at that very spot, the sun setting once again behind her, a young cadet approached. He couldn't have been more than 20. He wore the Academy's navy blue uniform and carried a sense of both pride and uncertainty. "Dr. Walker?" he asked shyly. She turned and smiled. "Yes. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, for what you're doing. My brother was stopped by a cop once. Nothing as bad as what happened to you, but it changed how I saw this job. You made me realize we have to be better." Lena studied his face, the sincerity, the nervousness, the spark of something hopeful. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then start by remembering this," she said. "Power doesn't make you right. Compassion does. Protecting people means seeing them first as human beings." He nodded solemnly, and she watched him walk away, his silhouette merging with the growing dusk. For the first time in a long time, Lena allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the peace that had eluded her for months. The city, her city, was learning. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. At home later that night, she sat by the window while David read over a new policy proposal. The quiet between them was companionable. The hum of distant sirens drifted through the open window, not menacing but ordinary, part of the rhythm of a city finally finding balance. David looked up from his papers. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked softly. Lena's gaze drifted out toward the skyline. "Every day," she said, but not with anger anymore, just with clarity. He nodded, understanding. She continued, her voice low but sure. "Justice isn't just a verdict or a punishment. It's a process. It's the daily work of making sure no one else has to go through what I did. That's what real accountability means." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "Then I think justice finally found its keeper." She smiled faintly. "No, David. Justice doesn't belong to any one of us. It belongs to everyone willing to stand for it." They sat in silence again, watching the city lights flicker like stars. Outside, the precinct clock tower struck midnight. A new day began. In the months that followed, documentaries, essays, and news specials would tell the story of Fifth and Elm. They would call it the turning point. They would praise Lena Walker's courage and David Walker's leadership. But to Lena, it wasn't about legacy or recognition. It was about survival and what one chooses to do after surviving. She often told her students at the university, where she eventually returned part-time, reform doesn't start in courtrooms or headlines. It starts in hearts. It starts the moment you decide silence is no longer acceptable. Every generation, she reminded them, inherits a broken system. Some walk away from it. Others, if they are brave enough, choose to rebuild it piece by piece. And so, when new recruits graduated from the academy, their oath included a line she had personally written. I swear to uphold the law, defend the innocent, and protect the truth, even when that truth indicts my own. It was a small addition, but it changed everything. Years later, when people spoke of the Walker Protocols, they spoke of them not as policies, but as principles. Principles born from a woman's refusal to bow to humiliation. Principles that taught a nation the difference between authority and justice. And for those who walked the corner of Fifth and Elm, the place where it all began, they didn't see tragedy anymore. They saw transformation. The air there was lighter now. The brick wall, once stained by cruelty, was painted with a mural of Lena herself, not as a victim, but as a teacher. Behind her, golden rays of sunlight spread across the wall. Beneath the image, a single quote read, "Justice is not always loud. Sometimes, it is the quiet work of the heart that refuses to forget." As long as that mural stood, as long as the city remembered, the lesson would endure. That dignity, once violated, can become the seed of reform. That truth, once silenced, can rebuild a system. And that one woman's quiet strength can echo louder than the roar of power.